Hello everybody, Pascal here, and yesterday I was interviewed by Ezequel Bistoletti for his Spanish language channel called Demoliendo Mitos de la Política, Demolishing Political Myths, and he allowed me to also upload this version here in its original English, and he will upload the Spanish version on his channel. So if you speak Spanish and you want to watch it in that language, please go over there and have a look. Thank you.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. Welcome back to Demolishing Political Myths. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming back Pascal Lottaz, who is a friend of the house. He is an associate professor at Kyoto University, and he hosts the YouTube channel Neutrality Studies. I recommend you to go visit it. It has a version in Spanish, and they have very, very good material there. So, Pascal, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Ezequiel, for having me back on your show.
Pascal, there are a lot of things taking place lately. We had some historic for weeks, starting with the meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska 30 days ago in Anchorage. Then we had 1 week ago or 1.5 weeks ago the SEO, the summit in Tianjin outside Peking. The SEO is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as you know. Later on, we had this amazing victory parade in China with Xi Jinping, with Putin sitting on his right, with Kim Jong-un as well, and a lot of world leaders somehow giving a message of multipolarism towards the West. And finally, we had the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok in Russia, with very interesting statements from Putin as well. So, taking all this together, what do you make of all these events and the message that they're giving to the world with regards to multipolarism, unipolarism, the West, the East, power structures, and so on?
Well, I mean, it's not that often that this many international events happen back to back, and some of them were planned a long time ago. I mean, or prepared, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, of course, also the forum. Other things happened very quickly, like the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, and then also the very next Monday. I mean, that happened on a Friday, and on Monday you see the Europeans flocking to Washington. Originally, Trump only wanted to invite Mr. Zelensky, but the Europeans just crashed the house and said we're going to come with him. And then Donald Trump actually used the opportunity to humiliate the Europeans quite significantly by having them line up in his office in front of his desk on these little chairs, and then even snapping pictures of that. It's absolutely fantastic. And what fascinates me the most is that our media in Europe portrays that as a win. You know, the Europeans being included and having a negotiation with the Americans. It's like no, this was clearly a talking down to, and you don't even realize it. I just had a talk with Anuradha Chenoy, an Indian scholar, and she said in India everybody realizes that was a huge humiliation and insult. But okay, the Europeans live in their own little bubble, and I think we will come back to this later. But to me, the what this signifies is definitely that we now have the final proof that even the last person, even Mark Rutte, must have understood that we are now living in the multipolar century, and that it is not up anymore to and particular country like the US, or even a grouping like the G7 or NATO, to dictate on the rest of the world what's going to happen. The WTO, the IMF don't have the structural power anymore to just keep other places silent and shut them up. And the others, they are now doing meetings that used to happen like once in a decade. The Bandung meeting of 55, the first time the global South met and actually was got noticed that there's a other group of countries. And then, like in the 60s, happened another one, like in Yugoslavia and so on, the non-aligned movement that sometimes met, and this grouping that within the UN every once in a while had a talking to each other. But overall, during the Cold War, those were you couldn't completely forget about them, but you could they paled they paled in comparison to like the bipolar structure and the importance of these two blocks. And then during the 1990s, nothing comparable ever happened, and everything was structured around the US, Europe, G7, G8. And you could see how you had this moment when Russia and China tried to integrate into that post Cold War structure, and that period is done and over with. So we are in a sense now definitely beyond the end of the Cold War. You know how for the last 30 years we always talked about the Cold War and the post Cold War. The post Cold War now has ended. We don't have a proper terminology for it yet. I would say probably we will call it probably something like the unipolar moment, the unipolar 30 years, and we're now post the unipolar 30 years in the new multipolar structure. And this multipolar structure seems to me to be moving and be driven to a large part actually by Asia, East and South Asia, the North Asia as well, with Russia, right, capturing large parts of North Asia, China, India, but also the ASEAN states, Southeast Asia, naturally, Africa and South America, also part of the entire development, especially within the BRICS. But the structural heavyweights are located on the eastern part of the Eurasian continent. And I think what we are witnessing is kind of the shift of the political gravity toward that place, which is not to say again that the others will not matter anymore, but this is a new phenomenon.
Let me take one of the most shocking pictures, or at least one of the most symbolic pictures that we've seen during those 4 weeks. Actually, in the SEO summit, we had this picture. I think it was even republished by Trump. This picture where we could see Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Narendra Modi smiling and holding each other's hands. In a context in which the US is establishing sanctions only against India, because India is still buying and will keep on buying Russian oil. Based on that, what do you think that Trump is trying to do? There has been this debate you have talked about on your channel about Trump and what his real position is with regards to foreign policy. Is Trump a peacemaker who is not allowed to do his job as he theoretically wanted to do? Or is he actually another representative of the US imperialism in this continuity agenda, as it is called, position, right? What do you make of that?
Good question. It's, there's this large debate online about whether or not Donald Trump is serious, and whether the Trump administration is actually the first sign of a shift in a genuine shift of US foreign policy, or if it is what Brian Beletic calls, just the latest version of the continuity of agenda. That overall, what we see is that time and again, the US will try to break its rivals, its strategic rivals, Russia and China in this case. And whenever they run against a brick wall, they kind of retreat, they reload, and then they pretend to want to be friends with everybody else. But what they're doing is just getting ready for the next kind of attack, overtly or covertly. And that currently what is happening with Russia is just the latest version of that, right? And this is a very important and serious argument. The thing is, we cannot exactly know what it is, because there are instances when US foreign policy and the foreign policy of great powers seriously shift. One of these moments happened between 41 and 45 in the US, because the US had a neutrality policy on its books for 150 years, and it was a pillar. It was a pillar of US foreign policy toward the Europeans. Not the kind of neutrality Switzerland or Austria are running, very different, very bellicose neutrality. But let me not get into this one. But it was important that they said, like, we are not going to get embroiled in stupid European little wars, petty war fighting. And after 45, they changed that. They said, like, we're not going to do what happened after the First World War. We're not going to retreat. We're actually going to do the opposite. We're going to put our soldiers everywhere, and we're going to have a completely new strategy toward Europe and the Eurasian continent. Actually, we're going to try to put as many military bases as we can in all corners of the world. And that was generally new. You didn't have that before 45. So there is this legitimate question also, are we seeing currently another like several year transition into a different foreign policy? Or is it, as Paletic says, it's just to say it the same as before? I view Donald Trump on the one hand as probably really different from part of the previous, especially the neoconservative establishment that we have seen. And we also saw that he seems to have learned out of his first term, because not all the important positions are staffed with neocons. Let's remember, before in the first administration, he had people like Bolton, like Pompeo in there, arch neocons in like very sensitive security positions. And his foreign policy followed them to a good degree, not completely, but to a good degree. What we're seeing now is that at least you have some restrainers in the cabinet, like Tulsi Gabbard, like Kennedy, although Kennedy is working, of course, on health questions. But you have some restrainers. Also, his vice president actually is not a complete arch hawk, although he does have bellicose rhetoric as well. But you see something of a more let me call it balanced in some sense cabinet, although people like Bassett, his commerce secretary, and so on, and also his Keith Kellogg are definitely on the neocon side. But you can see how there's a mix, and quite an eclectic mix, I would say. And on top of that is his personal naturel that we've learned so far is more or less that of a schoolboy bully. So I do believe that sometimes his instincts do take over, where he thinks that bullying others into submission will win him victories. And he definitely gets very far with that with the Europeans, and having the Europeans cave to them when it came to all of these trade negotiations and so on. Very quickly, Ursula just went over there to basically nod to everything and praise the daddy, right, including Mark Rutte praising their protector. And I don't think that he understands the difference between the Europeans and, like, let's say, the Indians. In his mind, probably the Indians, if the Europeans follow, then the Indians naturally should follow, because I mean they're not even on the same plane. So I don't think he has the understanding of what's happening in the rest of the world, in the global majority, in the global south, and that India is on a completely different trajectory than the Europeans are. And hence he applies the same approach. You can also see how the approach is one of picking out countries one by one, right? Negotiate with Japan, negotiate with Korea, with the Europeans collectively, but you've got them on a very short leash already, and with the Indians, and one by one, so that they cannot gang up against you, and then threaten each one, and also try to play the bilateral negotiations against them each other, right? Because what he very well understands is that if he gives 15% of tariffs to the Japanese, then the others will want that too. So by threatening 30, 40, 50% and then giving 115, you create an incentive for the others to agree to be tariffed, but at the same rate, because they want to be on the same level and have a level playing field on the US market. So he did that quite cleverly, but I think he's overplaying his hand very much at the moment. And overall, it's a bad look. It's a bad look outside the United States. This will impact the willingness of others to go along, because right now, again, we see also how in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, there's an entire framework of how countries agree to deal with each other, and that framework is built around voluntary voluntary adding something, like voluntarily joining, and of equality, more or less. There's never perfect equality, but more or less, you look at each other on eye level, and you try, at least to the outside, to portray that everything is happening on a fair and equitable basis. Compare that with the United States, that has no problem of humiliating its closest allies and let everybody know who's the top dog. These are just two very different models, and the global majority model is definitely more appealing. So which then leaves the US and Europeans, to a second degree, with just ever bigger stick, because the carrot's not working anymore. They don't have carrots. They're not thinking about carrots anymore.
One of the reasons why we have such a difficult time when we try to interpret Donald Trump is certainly his erratic nature as a character. One day he says one thing, on the next day he says exactly the opposite. But in this context, what we have seen over the last 2 weeks has been characterized by some analysts as a new stance within the many possible interpretations about Trump's government. And this new stance, this new position is called pivoting to homeland somehow. I don't know if you've heard about this, as Trump is taking over the governments of very important cities of the US. It was the case with Washington. It is said that he's going to do the same with Chicago. He has also mentioned that he would take other cities over by the federal government. And this, next to the fact that he's also amassing not troops necessarily, but battleships and aircrafts in the Caribbean basin next to Venezuela. For US Americans, very often the homeland is the Americas, right? Somehow some people are saying that he's going back to Monroe Doctrine, America for the Americans, and with America I mean the American continent, and the US, or the US government, turning back towards its own homeland and the American continent. Do you think that this could be the case, or is this just one more erratic movement in this Trump's administration?
I mean, in a sense, I would wish that was the case, although it would spell very bad omens, of course, for Central and South America, if the entire weight of the US came back to on just that part of the world. But I while yes, it's new that Donald Trump does this internally and within the Americas, the other part of the ledger is kind of missing to me, and that's this the signaling that the old strategy is over. Look, in Finland and Sweden just joined NATO 2 years ago, right? And the very next thing the United States started doing is immediately negotiate not an agreement in order to have NATO troops as like under a joint umbrella in joint bases on these places. It's immediately US bases. So there's now 15 and 17 US bases, and the base agreements are already done and signed and over, that allow the United States for at least 10 years to have their troops there in 15 and 17 bases. So that's more than 13, that's 32 new US bases in the Nordics. And that is not only not necessary, that is counterproductive if you actually take serious the Russian argument that they are feeling threatened by the proximity of NATO forces. It is also one of these places of joy and pride of the Europeans to say like, ha ha ha, look Russia, what you got, ha ha. But it is very counterproductive to serious negotiations about shared security and cooperative cooperation on the Eurasian continent. It's the opposite of the idea of the OSCE. and also of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, by the way, and the acknowledgement that security for one can only happen if security for the other happens. This very much now in the global South and global majority accepted dictum that in order to de-escalate the security dilemma, you need to take into consideration each other's security perceptions. And this is something that Trump could reverse. He could say, like, okay, let's take the troops out. Okay, let's work on de-escalating on that front and signal to Russia that we mean business, and not just create steps toward becoming a trusted partner again. And that's not happening, and it's not happening in the Nordics. It's not happening in the Middle East, in West Asia. It's not happening in Japan. I mean, there's no sign, I have not seen any, of US kind of withdrawal, or at least scaling down, even in the rhetoric. So in a sense, I interpret these latest steps more as adding another, like, what are they called? The Jenga pieces. You take it out here and you put it on top in order to have the tower taller, but everything becomes more unstable. So I think it's just the latest Jenga piling up of things that in the end is going to come crushing down, overstretching and overreaching in all theaters. But it goes hand in hand with the idea that the United States can achieve all things and anything, and there's nothing beyond US ability, which is, of course, a very neocon position. It's very, very neoconservative, this idea that we don't need to care about real constraints because anything can be achieved. You just need to will it. And that probably he gave in to the wrong kind of advice again. Maybe he believes it himself, I don't know. But also, like, renaming the Department of Defense to Department of War. It just shows an misinterpretation of what's going on. Although I must say, renaming it to Department of War is actually an act of honesty, because that's what it is. That's what it always has been. The thing, though, is that he doesn't rename it in order to be honest. He renames it in order to threaten, right? That's his rationale. His rationale is not how I and Glenn Deason and many others, Medea Benjamin, say, like, okay, it's more honest this way. At least we know. At least you're giving us a clear idea of what it is for. He says, like, no, this will change the rationale of everything, and it will show how tough we are. Peace through strength, peace through threatening war, which is, of course, the opposite of what the United Nations Charter says, and it's the opposite of what the other countries in the BRICS and SCO say, because they continuously say, like, we need to abide to the UN Charter. And the Europeans, and so far the Americans, always paid lip service to that. At least a lip service. It was highly hypocritical, but a lip service. And Donald Trump does away with the lip service. So in a sense, it's good and bad of what we can get out of it. But the motivation definitely is to just keep on threatening, and it works less and less.
Let's go to Ukraine. And do you see there the US stepping back somehow, scaling down, as we all wished for before Trump came to power, with his promise of somehow redirecting US foreign policy against China and going out of Ukraine? Do you think that's happening? And in the case it is this also taking place simultaneously with division of labor, as Hexeth put it, in the sense that Europe is taking over the lead there, with the supposedly coming of troops being sent there, even though there have been so many backs and forwards with this. But is the US finally stepping down and Europe taking over the lead, or is this just an image that they want to project?
And the thing is, the Europeans, they have the rhetoric of wanting to take the lead, but they lack the ability, and they actually know it, because had they if they wanted to take the lead, they would have. They had countless opportunities, but they always step back, because until now, the number one requirement that the Europeans say that we need from the US is this so-called backstop, which is just like just hot air. A backstop means that you get the Americans to guarantee that they will bail you out and that they will send troops, because the second the first troops, first European troops like German or French or whatever set foot in Ukraine, they're going to be annihilated by the Russians, and then the Europeans going to cry and tell daddy to come and help them. So basically it's an agreement that they do it jointly and that they go in together. And the US has categorically ruled that out under Trump. And the Europeans do not dare to do it, and they don't want. So this is also a good news. I mean, for all the hubris and all the stupidity and all the bloodletting and all the sending the last Ukrainian to die for European fantasies of breaking up Russia, for all of that, there's still enough rationality left in these capitals, in London, Berlin, Paris, to say like, no, if we go there alone, it's gonna be, I mean, we don't want an all-out war alone with the Russians. They want to try to push NATO, but pushing NATO means pushing the US, and the US has said repeatedly that's not what we do. And if you think about it, it actually makes sense, because the whole point of Ukraine is to have a proxy war, or coalition war, or implementation war, whatever you want to call it, have a war with Russia without having a proper NATO war with Russia. And they are sticking to that idea, at least for now. And the paradoxical thing is that by now, of course, the Europeans are how do you say that? I think you have an expression actually in Spanish, like Santa Santita, like more popely than more saintly than the Pope. and it's like, okay, we need to do what we believe, what the purpose was, and try to all of us together. And that's the speech acts on the one hand from the public media and so on, and from politicians you have them, but on the other hand you do see how the politicians actually are very unhappy with the even with the idea that the Americans might actually really want to come to a peace agreement with the Russians. Also because of course would take away their main talking point that they've been giving to their populations for the longest time. But again, at least for now, there seems to be some form of agreement that an all-out war with Russia is not what they want, which doesn't mean that they're not preparing for it, because we see a lot of preparations happening, and the Germans say it out loud. The Finns are saying like, it's not a question of if but when, and that they need to now ramp up their military production. But at least, even if that's the case, they seem to understand that they are now too weak for that, and that it needs to wait. But that's of course a scary perspective.
I just wanted to go there with my next question. As you said, Europe would love to send troops to Ukraine and help Ukraine win the war. However, its leaders realize that this is not possible so far. But at the same time, we see this preparation for war. We had 1 week ago Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz basically announcing the reestablishment of the military service, so far as non-compulsory, but it was very clearly stated that this is only temporal. The idea is to making it obligatory pretty soon, as it was in the past. He also said that Germany wants 500,000 troops in its army. Nowadays, I think it has something around 100 or 150,000, maybe a little bit more than that, but nothing comparable to that. We have in Germany as well the change of the constitution so that Germany can take more debt in order to rearm. On the European level, we have this rearm program with 800 billion euros assigned to the rearmament of Europe. We have also this rhetoric continuously being fed to us through media, through political leaders about the evil Russians who want to take over Europe. So, long introduction for a short question. Is Europe preparing for war? in a few years. You've been in Europe some weeks ago. How have you felt this being here?
Haven't interacted with those parts. I mean, with the security crowd in Europe at all, so I can't give you any feedback on that one. But I mean, the rhetoric is clearly in that direction. On the one hand, it is. I mean, it is like the way that the Europeans are currently portraying their security situation in apocalyptic terms, and the Russians trying to take over all of Europe. Of naturally, this shows us that they want to rearm, and I mean, there's no doubt that they want to. The question is, can they? Because the whole strategy that they've been following is one that now leads them to deindustrialization. And we must, I wonder if they realize, but I mean, they must. I mean, they must realize, despite all of the BS that we're being fed in the news and the media, and by politicians who tell us how great NATO is and how strong it is, biggest alliance, strongest alliance ever, blah blah blah. Even those people must realize that what we've just witnessed is that over 3.5 years, that alliance wasn't able to produce as much military uh, uh, um, hardware as the Russians did. The Russians outproduced them. This was a war of attrition. This is, of course, something that was kept well hidden from the general public. The general public was led to believe that the Russians are desperately trying to get to Kiev and take over all of Ukraine, and then that they failed in doing that. They were pushed back, and then somehow it stalled. And the Russians are now being very weak, although they're a huge threat, of course. But what really happened, and it is utterly clear. I mean, I don't think that serious observers now would not agree with the statement that what the Russians were doing is a war of attrition. They were in the second phase. The first phase of the war was one where even Vladimir Putin said, what we wanted is to scare the Ukrainians into making an agreement for the neutrality of Ukraine. That was the original phase one, when they went in with way too little troops, 140,000 troops, way too little to capture Ukraine. And they went all the way to Kiev, then they negotiated, and then, of course, like Boris Johnson and so on, the negotiations fell apart, and then they had to withdraw and regather their forces. And it took them a year to change the entire approach how this went, but they went into a war of attrition for 2 years. They just, anything that NATO could throw at them, anything, Leopard tanks, the different vehicles, the different munitions, anything, they just grinded it down. They let it coming. They ground it down. Even the Great Summer Offensive of 2 years ago, they just took it, absorbed it, and pushed back, and they destroyed the entire production, everything that NATO could spare. NATO still has stuff themselves. That's, of course, what some of the ultra militarists criticize. They say we should give our last tank to the Ukrainians, but there's people, militaries in Germany and France and Poland and so on, who say like, wait a second, we are now running very low, and we need to keep that for ourselves. So the Russians ground down the NATO, and it must be clear that this is a structural problem, and this is an industrial problem. They don't even have enough shells. I mean, they were going scrambling for shells while the Russians kept firing at a much higher rate, right? So I am convinced that that in the leadership positions, they do understand that they are now not in any position to actually fight a war. But again, try to do it in the future and gear up toward that. And this is where your point is going. Question is, again, can they? Because reindustrialization takes a long time, and it would take a long time even if Europe had access to cheap Russian oil. It would take a long time even if they weren't so structurally kept on a short leash with the United States, and if they had access to raw materials. But they're losing that access at the moment. So my hope is that they are unable to do that, including even with the US military industrial complex. And just one last point, if the German chancellor argues that they need 500,000 people in the Bundeswehr, it's just another one of these moments when the Germans break their international agreements, because in the treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany, the outcome of the 4+2 treaty that allowed the two Germanys to merge, or like for West Germany to take over East Germany, it is written that the Bundeswehr is capped at 370,000 soldiers. If there is a political plan to breach that cap, it is another one of these breaches of international law that the Germans always say that they keep sacrosanct, and that they berate the Russians for not following. Just as a side note.
One more question about Ukraine. Putin said in China that if nothing changes, in the end, the Ukraine problem will be solved militarily. This is something that several analysts have been saying. The most famous one being John Mersheimer. Do you think that this is going to be the case, Pascal, that in the end, the resolution of this conflict, which is just one dimension of a much bigger conflict, as we know, in this case, the final solution will take place militarily exclusively?
I hope not. I mean, it would save many lives if there was a political agreement. And again, we are not the war between Russia and Ukraine in this smaller part. Let's not speak of the bigger structural war between Russia and NATO and the West in general. But let's just look at the small one. It's very, very different from something like, let's say, Gaza, the genocide there. It's not a war of annihilation that's being fought. It is a very, very traditional, classical Clausewitzian army against army, state against state war about political goals. And these political goals can be, as Clausewitz told us, be achieved either through negotiations on the at the table or on the battlefield. And the strategy the Russians are now implementing, and they've been saying for 2 years, there will be no ceasefire, we will negotiate while shooting, is that they do this dual track, but dual track meaning military and diplomatic. If they can get it through the diplomatic route, they will take that. But if there's no agreement, in order to to address what the Russians call root causes, on the one hand, the neutrality of Ukraine, on the other hand, a security framework for the continent, and the political situation inside Ukraine, where they want to get these ultra right wing factions out of politics, and actually also and lastly the territorial disputes, where they now say, like, look, these four oblasts are now ours. Period. You've got to accept that. You had a chance 3 years ago, but now you've got to swallow that. Unless these conditions aren't met, then the Russians will push forward with the military operation. The question then for them will be, what is a military solution? Because I have never talked to any kind of Russian expert or specialist who says that it is in the interest of Russia to occupy all of Ukraine. Especially the western part of Ukraine is so rabidly anti-Russian that if you try to swallow that, you would swallow a poison pill, right? So that cannot be the military goal. The goal would have to be to bring the war to a place where you can establish a security zone, several tens, maybe 100 kilometers through all the length, and then kind of like a Korean model, right? Basically divide and there and bring the fighting to a stop over there. But even that is that's not a good, and that's not a secure position. So in my view, that cannot be an ideal situation. So the ideal situation is still to come to some form of political understanding that will politically keep the situation stable. And just one more side note, when the Europeans say that they think about sending boots on the ground, as you asked before, as a security, what are they calling it? Peacekeepers. And we need to think about Ukraine. Once the fighting stops, we need to deter Russia from attacking again. It is such a stupid thing to say, because the Russians already made it clear that any kind of NATO boots on in Ukraine are unacceptable to them, and that's why they're fighting this war in the first place. So they won't stop if that is the idea of the Europeans. How it will end, they won't. And secondly, why would you care about the next war if the current war is still ongoing? It makes utterly zero sense to me, which is why it is just such an empty speech act of the Europeans. It's just another thing to keep the discussion going and to look to their own populations as if though they were doing something, when in fact they're utterly aimless at the moment. The problem that this creates for the Russians is, of course, like how do you get to that kind of moment when you have some form of agreement? Because you need an agreement. Europe needs agreements, and every large war of the past hundreds of years always ended in some form of agreement that then kept the stability until the next time everything broke down. 1648 Westphalia, 1815 Vienna, 1918 in Paris, Versailles, 1945 the United Nations, and these declarations, right? You need these moments when people get together around a piece of paper and actually kind of, not completely, but kind of agree that at least this one they don't disagree with, or they keep it. And so we need to get to that moment, and unfortunately it is right now the Europeans that stand mostly in the way of this. The negotiations would look differently if Paris, London, Berlin were actually also agreeing that fine, we now need to wind this down, and we take the Russians serious, and we create a structure that they can say yes to and that we can monitor. You don't need to believe them. You just need to monitor and create something that you can somehow control, like arms controls. But it is the Russians and the Chinese and the global South that speaks in these terms, also at the SCO, with their language of multilateralism. The Europeans and Americans still speak in ultimatums and threats.
One last question, Pascal. It seems that regardless of the way in which the Ukraine war will end, this being strictly in a military way or in a negotiated diplomatic agreement, it seems that that war will not be the last battle within the more general war, the more general conflict, which is basically a big conflict regarding the reconfiguration of the world order, with the new powers emerging and disputing, challenging the US unipolarism. In this context, where do you see the possible future points of clash? You mentioned Finland with the US bases and the incredibly stupid abandonment of neutrality, which had been for Finland so positive over several decades. We have Moldova as well, with Transnistria and Gagauzia there. We have now Armenia having a reapproachment to the US, with Pashinyan meeting Trump and the Azerbaijan president, and somehow reintroducing this project of this corridor, of this Sangesur corridor, which is in turn for Iran very, very problematic. We have almost certainly the continuation of the war between Israel and Iran, because most probably Israel will attack again Iran sooner or later. So where do you see possible future conflicts in this broader war regarding the reconfiguration of the world order?
I mean, the most probable ones you already laid out. I mean, there's definitely going to be a continuation of the war with Iran. And it's not just Israel. It's always Israel plus the United States and plus the annexes in Europe. That one isn't finished. That is just being paused at the moment. Finland is also like weirdly being built up at the moment, and we've seen that Mr. Stubb was in Washington together with the big boys and girls of Europe, right? And Stubb was so out. I mean, the president of Finland, he was so out of place that he actually needed to address this. Why is the president of small Finland here? Excuse me. And he said, well, because we have some experience in settling a war with the Russians, yeah, which was in 44 when you had to give up basically and then swallow the pill of like being told what the future is going to look like because you fought on the side with the Nazis. And then Finland, of course, out of those experiences, which were also, it's not, Finland also was attacked by the Soviet Union in the Winter War, right? And so there's a lot of back and forth here. But in the end, what it led to was this Finnish neutrality, which stabilized the entire Nordic flank, right, and very successfully so. And that this has been given up, and that this is now being inversed into the opposite. It's a very very worrying development. Although I must say, the Finland is now, of course, a NATO member, so the NATO countries risk much, much more if there was ever an attempt at doing something similar through Finland as they did through Ukraine, because not sending troops to Ukraine is fine, of course, because they're not in NATO. But if they then decided not to send troops to Finland, which is a NATO member, that would be a completely different story. And just let me tell you, for all the audience, we generally think it's not possible, but an attack against one is an attack against all, right? So all the other NATO members are contractually obliged under the NATO treaty to send troops, right? No, not right. Wrong. the NATO treaty says that the other countries need to do and are supposed to support with all means at their disposal, which may include military means, but they're not obliged to do that. For all intents and purposes, Ukraine could have been a NATO member and have received exactly the same level of support, not more and not less, even as a NATO member. So that would be, is in theory, the NATO, if something happened in Finland, NATO members could say like, yeah, we will support you, we'll send you weapons and so on, but boots on the ground, no, not for me, Germany, not for me, France, not for me, Britain, because you look, Article 5 says I can support how I want, but I don't have to. It's a relatively weak article, actually, just to underscore that. But that, of course, if that happened, would be the final death knell of NATO, because then you would have no more reason to exist. So whatever happens with Finland needs to be much more carefully calibrated. Armenia, in my view, is being dismantled at the moment. It's being taken apart. And it's probably one of I see it as probably the next victim of this idea that you position yourself strategically and you encircle your opponents, which actually would place or would tell us that it's probably Brian Barletic who is right with his argument that the overall grand strategy of the US hasn't changed. The idea of encircling the others and breaking their periphery apart and then using this as points of entry in order to subvert from the inside your opponent, that strategy is still in place, and that overall the US and NATO will still try to break their opponents apart. Venezuela is a place where we might see a war, but it would be a really, really dumb thing to do. But then again, we've seen so many dumb things coming from the coalition of the willing. Even the fact that the US and the Europeans at the moment still use that term that goes back to the Iraq War, which by now we know was a utterly illegal and a huge crime on international law, and everybody accepts was a mistake. But the jargon that came out of it is still being proudly deployed by these technocrats. That just tells us that the mentality hasn't changed. I do hope we can avoid this. The last flashpoint is, of course, Taiwan is, of course, the Pacific, and maybe even more than Taiwan. I actually believe the Philippines. History somehow has this tendency of producing these surprises, which later on, once you look back, look as evident. Oh, of course it had to happen there, but they were not evident at all at the moment when they happened. In the Second World War in 1941, in November, December, the Americans knew exactly that the Japanese would attack them. They knew it was coming because of the communications that was breaking down and because of the position that the political position that emerged. But they were expecting an attack in the Philippines. They weren't expecting an attack in Hawaii. That's the surprise, was that it was Pearl Harbor, not that it came. And in this sense, I do believe that also today we might expect in the Pacific and something happening in Taiwan, but it might be a different place. And the Philippines, to me, looks like one of these potential flashpoints that we don't have sufficiently on our radar.
Pascal, it's been a pleasure talking to you again. Please let our audience know where they can follow your work.
Go to YouTube and type in neutrality studies and click either on the English one or the Spanish one. And by the way, thank you to all Spanish speakers out there on YouTube, because you made my Spanish language channel also grow fantastically. It's the biggest one of all the foreign language channels I have. So gracias. Muchas gracias a todos.
Pascal, hope to talk to you again very soon. Thank you very much and goodbye.